Has the heart of Ukraine, Kiev, become the new Twilight Zone? This is a question that Douglas Mcgregor, a man of substantial insight, has posed. Picture this. You're stepping into a world of shadows and substance, of things and ideas. You're stepping into a world where the government might resort to violence, and ceasefires hang in the balance. This is the world Macgregor sees when he looks at Kiev. This isn't a simple conflict. Macgregor underlines the complications of dealing with a Russian government that's turned its back on the West. He speaks from a place of knowledge with connections likely reaching to the Joint Chiefs and perhaps even the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Remember when General Milley's advice to negotiate for Ukrainians found its way to the New York Times, only to be retracted under pressure? It's a poignant reminder that the ultimate decision-maker isn't in Kiev or Moscow, but in the White House. Yet, who in the current administration would dare to acknowledge any grave errors endangering Ukraine? In Washington, the belief that Russia is feeble and inept is almost universal. This belief fuels the continued support for Ukraine, with talks of reinforcing Ukrainians or establishing a secure zone near the Polish border. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But unlike past conflicts where the US wielded significant leverage, the situation with Russia presents a different reality. There's an over-reliance on Polish forces despite their bravery, and a notion that NATO, despite its lack of substantial military capacity, can solve the problem. The situation brings to mind Hitler's unrealistic plans in 1944 and the Battle of the Bulge. Grand ideas, but with resources running thin. Most of their ammunition and weapons have either been depleted or captured by Russians. The information from Kiev hasn't been reliable either. Reports suggest Ukrainian forces are pressuring civilians into military service, a chilling echo of historical conscription tactics. Yet, Ukrainian soldiers remain confident. But just as German soldiers echoed similar sentiments in 1945, caution is necessary when interpreting their optimism. So what's the final picture? Macgregor paints a complex scene where the ultimate decision lies with the White House, where the belief that Russia is feeble fuels continued support for Ukraine, and where the optimism of Ukrainian soldiers must be interpreted with caution. In essence, Macgregor's viewpoint highlights the intricacies of the situation in Kiev, reminding everyone of the need for a realistic assessment of the situation and a careful approach to decision-making. Could the world be teetering on the edge of a new global conflict? In the world of geopolitics, numbers matter, and sometimes they can be misleading. Reports are suggesting that around 200,000 fresh combat troops are ready to enter the fray, a number likely to swell to a staggering 700,000 by January. With approximately half of these already engaged in combat operations, Russia is flexing its military muscle. Coupled with rigorous training, this significant numerical advantage is giving Russia a considerable edge, but they're not alone in this. Belarus is fully on board, offering resources and potentially over 75,000 troops stationed along the Polish and Lithuanian borders. Poland's strategic importance in countering Russia is being acknowledged, and there are rising concerns about potential American intervention. Echoes of past conflicts like Vietnam resonate, and there's a palpable apprehension that decisions may be influenced by influential figures in Washington rather than reflecting the reality on the ground in Ukraine. Drawing parallels with World War II, Churchill once highlighted the importance of looking at the broader trend rather than individual battles. Despite initial setbacks, he remained confident in the overall trajectory favoring the Allies. Similarly, the Russians, despite a slow start, have not suffered significant defeats. They're strategically positioned to defend annexed territories while preparing for major offensives in the coming months. The recent mobilization of 300,000 reservists indicates Russia's commitment to bolstering its forces. The current trajectory suggests that this mobilization will continue, potentially increasing the number of troops to 1 million by January. This buildup reflects a response to perceived threats and demands for surrender, which Putin and his advisors reject. The recent discussions appear to be a trial balloon to gauge public reaction. There's genuine concern about potential US involvement in Ukraine. The idea of a coalition of the willing indicates a lack of unity within NATO, with most European nations reluctant to engage in conflict with Russia. The feasibility of assembling such a coalition is questionable, considering the limited availability of troops from allied nations. The urgency stems from the dire situation in Ukraine, with diminishing manpower and a dwindling ability to mount effective counterattacks. The presence of Polish soldiers and a foreign legion highlights the desperate attempts to sustain military operations. Despite the lack of evidence supporting direct confrontation with Russia, some figures in Washington seem determined to pursue such a course, believing in the possibility of coercing Russian submission. This course of action is viewed as risky and misguided. Reports suggest that there are approximately 5,000 troops consisting of light infantry and 60 aircraft, potentially supported by Romanian forces. This deployment seems to represent a desire for a show of force. In summary, the world is watching as the situation unfolds. The numbers, the alliances, the historical parallels, and the potential for a new global conflict all paint a picture of a delicate balance of power. The decisions made in the coming months will have far-reaching implications, and only time will tell how this geopolitical chess game will play out. In the grand chessboard of geopolitics, the game is not just about kings and queens, but also about the pawns and knights, the bishops and rooks. It's a world where every decision, every move, carries with it a ripple effect that resonates across continents, impacting economies, cultures, and lives. Today, we delve into the complex world of geopolitics, where the stakes are high and the rules of the game are constantly changing. Imagine a world divided into fractions. The coalition of the willing is one such fraction, yet a portion of this coalition is currently stationed in Poland, sparking speculation about possible actions in Odessa. But let's not forget, Odessa has deep historical and cultural ties to Russia. Any interference could stoke the fire of tension, leading to significant casualties. The thought of nuclear weapons being used in times of heavy losses is a chilling one. While Russia hasn't shown an inclination towards nuclear escalation, their stance on responding to nuclear attacks is crystal clear. The perils associated with the concept of limited nuclear warfare are evident, highlighting the need for prudence in handling the situation. We are standing on the edge of a precipice, woefully underprepared for such an endeavor. The infrastructure isn't in place, ammunition supplies are lacking, and the proposed force sizes are inadequate. While the Russians made mistakes in their approach, they at least had guidelines to avoid harming fellow Orthodox Slavs. We, on the other hand, lack such constraints and are mulling over entering without adequate forces against the vast expanse of Ukraine. The idea of intervention seems more plausible than nuclear conflict, but the exact likelihood remains uncertain. There's a growing concern among insiders about the direction of policy, hinting at a shift in thinking. Washington's governance style leans heavily on public compliance with little opposition for military actions abroad. However, this complacency has led to reckless decision-making, akin to a child playing with electrical sockets and forks. Hence, the idea of intervening in Ukraine is dangerously foolhardy, akin to sticking a fork into an electrical outlet. The only significant territory loss reported was near Karlov, where Russian forces encountered minimal resistance and subsequently withdrew. Ukrainian attempts to regain control, particularly in areas like Hera, have been met with intense Russian opposition. Despite sporadic gains, there's been no substantial withdrawal of Russian forces. Behind the front lines, sizable Russian contingents are positioned, indicating a focus on larger strategic objectives rather than minor territorial shifts. This suggests coordinated efforts involving hundreds of thousands of troops across multiple fronts. NATO, once revered, now faces internal challenges and waning public support, exacerbated by economic troubles and strained relations due to sanctions against Russia. The impact of these sanctions on European economies, coupled with Russia's retaliatory measures, further destabilizes the situation. Amidst pressing domestic issues like immigration and rising crime rates, many Europeans question the portrayal of Russia as a significant threat. In conclusion, the geopolitical landscape is a complex web of alliances, conflicts, and power plays. The current situation underscores the potential risks and outcomes of military actions and interventions. The stakes are high, and the decisions made today will shape the world of tomorrow. It's a high-stakes game, and we're all players whether we like it or not. Could it be that the current state of European involvement in the conflict is more symbolic than substantive? An intriguing thought, isn't it? Europe's military capabilities once perceived as robust and formidable, now seem more symbolic than substantive. The lack of recent combat experience and preparation for a confrontation with a power like Russia casts a shadow on Europe's readiness. Meanwhile, the Russian military, previously dismissed as inept, has demonstrated resilience and effectiveness throughout the conflict, severely weakening the Ukrainian government. A belief initially held was that pressure on Putin would lead to his resignation and destabilize Russia. However, this notion has been dispelled. Russia, with its vast resources and Putin's strong public support, is far from destabilization. Behind closed doors, European leaders likely acknowledge their misjudgment, yet they appear to be stuck in a loop, persisting with current approaches, doubling down on failed policies. In essence, there's an acknowledgement of being on the wrong path. But without a clear plan B, leaders may resort to prolonging the status quo. The suggestion to send Nancy Pelosi to Kyiv only underscores the lack of coherent solutions. The situation is reminiscent of the last days of Pompeii, where blame is sought amid the chaos. Meanwhile, Zelensky's authority seems diminished, with nationalists exerting control and resorting to harsh measures to maintain order among dwindling forces. Despite efforts, the Ukrainian military remains defeated, unable to reclaim territory. Much of the Russian combat force has withdrawn for rest and refitting, with recent fighting in Donbas carried out by separatist forces backed by heavy artillery. Putin's objectives seem clear: to secure strategic positions without crossing certain boundaries. He seeks a Ukraine that is independent, but not hostile or used as a Western pawn. European concerns, particularly in Berlin and Rome, center on the potential for continued Ukrainian involvement as a tool against Russia, leading to perpetual conflict. Ultimately, Putin aims to avoid a NATO border and maintain stability in the region. If he finds the situation untenable due to our actions, then we're essentially cornering him once more. It's time for this to come to a close, and the Russians seem poised to make that happen in the next 30 days. What's crucial to understand is that presidents tend to receive intelligence that aligns with their preferences. This is a distortion of truth. Indeed, our loss of perspective is concerning. We've adopted a mindset of invincibility, leading us to disregard truth when convenient. This mindset has landed us in considerable trouble, especially in dealing with Russia, a far cry from the scenarios in Iraq or Afghanistan. The rhetoric coming from Washington, particularly regarding Russia, is unprecedentedly aggressive and bellicose. Never before have we witnessed such rhetoric. Meanwhile, our armed forces are being systematically undermined. Imagine being in the shoes of our servicemen and women only to find out that their new commander is someone like Tiny Tim, accompanied by a host of identity politics directives that overshadow performance and merit. In summary, the state of European involvement in the conflict is more symbolic than substantive. Russia's military effectiveness throughout the conflict has been a surprise. Europe's misjudgment of the situation and persistence with failed policies has led to a prolonged status quo. Putin's objectives are clear, and the Russians seem poised to end the conflict in the next 30 days. The distortion of truth and aggressive rhetoric from Washington is concerning, particularly as our armed forces are systematically undermined.
Have we ever stopped to ponder why the military recruitment standards of today seem to be drastically different from what they once were? The state of military recruitment today paints a vivid picture of a system struggling to maintain the same standards it once prided itself on. In the past, recruitment standards were rigorous and uncompromising. Only the best and the brightest, the most physically fit and mentally sound, were deemed suitable to serve and protect the nation. The military was a place where discipline, honor, and a sense of duty were instilled, and only those who could uphold these values were welcomed. Fast forward to the present day, and it seems that the situation has taken a dramatic turn. The recruitment criteria have noticeably softened. The military now seems to accept individuals with lower IQs, criminal records, and even substance abuse issues. It raises the question, why has there been such a shift in the recruitment process? Some might argue that the advent of remote warfare has lessened the need for physically fit and mentally sharp soldiers. A push of a button can now replace what a soldier once did on the battlefield. But is this really the case? Is the military now simply a reflection of society's lowered standards? A case in point is Lloyd Austin, a man who has seemingly benefited from affirmative action within the military system. Despite his rapid rise through the ranks, his actions and attitudes appear to be contradictory to the very institution he represents. It's perplexing to see senior officers passively accept this new norm, often deflecting any questioning with a simple, just following orders. Take, for instance, the $40 billion package passed in May. Only half of this amount is allocated for military aid. The other half? Well, it's designated for nation-building endeavors and humanitarian assistance. But here's the kicker. A large chunk of this military aid never leaves the United States. Instead, the funds are rerouted to the Pentagon, which then circulates the money within the defense industry. It's a feedback loop of financial transactions and political incentives, with the military at the heart of it all. In conclusion, there's a stark contrast between the military recruitment standards of the past and the present. From stringent standards and a rigid recruitment process, we've moved to a more relaxed approach, accepting candidates who wouldn't have made the cut in the past. It's a reflection of a changing society and the evolving nature of warfare. But at what cost? Is it worth compromising the very values that the military once stood for? Just some food for thought.